An Acceptable Time by Madeleine L'Engle, Chapter 3. In her own time, weak with relief, Polly sat on the stone bridge, dangling her legs over the book, trying to return to normalcy. Why do northern trees shed their leaves, she asked herself. Is it to reduce their exposure to extreme cold? That sounded sensible, and she wanted things to be sensible because nothing about the morning had been sensible, and inside her warm anorak she felt cold. She got up and continued along the path, looking for the slim girl with a heavy dark braid. But Anarol had been in that other time, not the now of Polly's present. Nevertheless, she pushed along the path, cut through low bushes, and on a high precipice from which she could look over the swampy valley to the hills beyond. Her uncles, Sandy and Denny's, had cut paths through the brush when they were young, and the wildlife had more or less kept them open. She would need to come out with clippers to cut back some of the overgrowth. She stood on a high rock, looking westward. The landscape rippled, with gentle color, muted golds now predominating, green of pine suddenly appearing where fallen leaves had left bare branches. Then, below her, down where the bed of brook should be, she saw a flash of brightness, and Bishop Kalubra appeared out of the bushes, wearing a yellow cap and jacket and carrying a heavy-looking stone. A steep path led down the precipice, which would have been easy to follow had it not been crisscrossed with bittersweet blackberry brambles that caught at her as she plunged downhill toward the bishop, scratching her legs and hands, catching in her clothes. The bishop was hailing her with pleasure, holding out the stone and explaining that he hadn't been looking for ogham stones, but there was one right there in an old stone wall, and wasn't it a glorious morning? "Bishop!" she gasped as she came to him. "I've been back!" He stopped so abruptly and completely that the air seemed to quiver. "What?" "I crossed the threshold, or whatever Anarol calls it. I went back to her time." His voice was a whisper. He looked as though he were about to drop the stone. "When?" "Just now. I've just come out of it. Bishop, while it was happening, it was all so sudden and so strange. I didn't have time to feel anything much, but now I think I'm terrified." Her voice quavered. He put the stone down, touched her arm reassuringly. "Don't be terrified. It will be all right. It will work out according to God's purpose." "Will it?" "I didn't expect this, that you saw her yesterday at the pool?" Polly felt cold, though the sun was warm. "She says that she and Corrales, he's the one by the oak, she says they can cross the thresholds of time because they're druids." "Yes." The bishop kept his hand on Polly's shoulder as though imparting strength. "We've lost many gifts that were once available." He bent down to pick up the stone. "We'd better head back to your grandparents' house. This is the shortest way if you want to follow me." He was definitely wobbly on his long, thin legs, trying to tuck the stone under one arm so that he could balance himself with the other, reaching for small trees or large vines to help pull himself along. They came to another curve of the brook, and he stopped, looked at the water flowing between and around the rocks, and made a successful leap across, dropping the stone, which Polly retrieved. "I'll carry it for a while," she offered. She followed the old bishop, who scurried along a nearly overgrown path, then turned sharply uphill, scrabbling his way up like a crab. At their feet were occasional patches of red partridge berries. A spruce branch stretched across their path, and he held it aside for Polly, continuing along his irregular course, until he pushed through a thicket of shadblow and wild cherry, and they emerged at the star-watching rock. "Bishop," Polly said, what happened? It's crazy." He did not speak. The sun rose higher. A soft wind moved through the trees, shaking down more leaves. "Maybe I dreamed it?" "Sometimes I don't know what is a dream and what is reality. The line between them is very fine." He took the ogham stone from her and set it down on the star-watching rock, folded his legs and sat down, indicated that she was to sit beside him. "Tell me exactly what happened." "I got up early and went for a walk, and as I came near the star-watching rock, everything changed. The ground quivered. I thought it was an earthquake, and then I saw that the trees were much bigger. Sort of primeval forest, and the mountains were huge and jagged and snow-topped." He nodded. "Yes." "And I know you've been there back." "Yes." "Is it real?" He nodded. "Do my grandparents know about this, Dr. Louise?" He shook his head. They don't believe in such things. They believe in the Ogham stones. Yes, they're tangible. But haven't you told them? He sighed. My dear, they don't want to hear. But Bishop, you took Anarol to Dr. Louise when she cut her finger. How do you... Anarol told me. Yes, oh, my dear. I didn't know what to do. I didn't stop to think. I just took her and ran, and thank heavens Louise was in her office. So she does know. He shook his head. No, I told her, and she thought I was joking or out of my mind. I've tended periodically to bring in waifs and strays for her to mend, and she thinks Annie was just another. Besides, that's what she wants to think. Have you had breakfast? No. Let's go back to your grandparents and have some coffee. I need to think. Thursday is All Hallows Eve. Halloween, she'd completely forgotten. He scrambled to his feet, picked up the Ogham stone. That may partly explain the time of year. Bishop, my grandparents don't know you've done what I did. Gone back 3,000 years. Do you realize how extraordinary it sounds? They've never seen Corrales or Anarol, but you've seen them. You've crossed the threshold. If you hadn't, would you believe it? He was right. The whole thing did sound crazy. Time thresholds, 3,000 years, circles of time, but it had happened. She didn't see how she and the bishop could have dreamed the same dream. Bishop, how long have you been going back and forth between then and now? Since last spring. A few months after I came to live with Louise. How often? Often enough to teach Anarol to speak English, she thought. Reasonably often, but I can't plan it. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Polly, child, let's go. I really feel the need to confess to your grandparents, whether they believe me or not. They're pretty good at believing, Polly said, more than most people. The bishop shifted the stone from one arm to the other. I never thought you'd become involved. I never dreamed this could happen. That you should... I feel dreadfully responsible. She offered, Shall I carry the Ogham stone? Please. He sounded terribly distraught. She took the stone and followed him. When they crossed the wall that led to the field, Polly saw Louise the larger watching them, not moving. The bishop, not even noticing the snake, scrambled across the wall and started to run toward the house. Polly's grandparents were in the kitchen. Everything was reassuringly normal. Her grandfather was reading the paper. Her grandmother was making pancakes. Breakfast was usually catch as catch can. Mrs. Murray often took coffee and a muffin to the lab. Mr. Murray hurried outdoors, working about the yard while the weather held. Good morning, Polly. Nason, Mrs. Murray sounded unsurprised as they panted in. Polly scratched and disheveled from her plunge down the precipice. Alex requested pancakes, and since he's a very undemanding person, I was happy to oblige. Join us. I've made more than enough batter. I hope I'm not intruding. The bishop seated himself. Polly tried to keep her voice normal. Here's another Ogham stone. Where shall I put it? If there's room, put it beside the one that Nays brought in last night, her grandfather said. How many pancakes can you eat, Nays? I don't know. I'm not sure I can eat anything. I don't think I'm hungry. Nason, what's wrong? You don't feel well? I'm fine. He looked at Polly. Oh dear, what have I done? What have you done? Mr. Murray asked. Polly said, You didn't do anything, Bishop. It just happened. Mrs. Murray put a stack of pancakes in front of him, and absently he lavished butter, poured a river of syrup, ate a large bite, put down his fork. I may have done something terrible. Nason, what's going on? Mr. Murray asked. The bishop took another large bite, shook his head. I didn't think it would happen. I didn't think it could. What? Mr. Murray demanded. I thought the time gate was open only to me. I didn't think... He broke off. Polly, her grandfather asked, do you know what all this is about? Polly poured herself a mug of coffee and sat down. The man by the oak, the one both Zachary and I saw, lived in the time of the Ogham stones. She did her best to keep her voice level. This morning, when I went off for a walk, I don't know what it's all about, but somehow or other, I went through the bishop's time gate. Nays! The bishop bent his head. I know, it's my fault. It must be my fault. Mea culpa. Mrs. Murray asked, Polly, what makes you think you went through a time gate? Everything was different, Grand. The trees were enormous, sort of like Hiawatha. This is the forest primeval. and the mountains were high and jagged and snow-capped, young mountains, not ancient hills like ours, and where the valley is, there was a large lake. This is absurd. Mrs. Murray put a plate of pancakes in front of her husband, then fixed the plate for Polly. Nason, Mr. Murray expostulated. The bishop looked unhappy. Whenever I've tried to talk about it, you've been disbelieving and, well, disapproving. And I don't blame you for that, so I've kept quiet. I wouldn't have believed it either if it hadn't kept happening. But I thought it was just me, part of being old and nearly ready to move on to... But Polly... That Polly should have... Well, of course! Of course what? Mr. Murray sounded more angry with each question. Polly saw Annie first at the pool, the bishop used the diminutive of Annerl tenderly. Annie who? Annerl, Polly said. She's the girl who came to the pool last night. When you were digging for the pool, the bishop asked, what happened? We hit water, Mr. Murray said. We're evidently over an aquifer, an underground river. But this is the highest point in the state, Polly protested. Would there be an underground river this high up? It would seem so. The bishop put down his fork. Somehow the stack of pancakes had disappeared. You do remember that most holy places, such as the sites of the great cathedrals in England, were on ground that was already considered holy before even the first pagan temples were built? And the interesting thing is that under most of these holy places is an underground river. This house and the pool are on a holy place. That's why Annerl was able to come to the pool. Nonsense, Mrs. Murray started. Mr. Murray sighed as though in frustration. We love the house and our land, he said. But it's a bit far-fetched to call it holy. This house is what? The bishop asked. Well over 200 years old? Parts of it, yes. But the Ogham stones indicate there were people here 3,000 years ago. Nathan, I've seen the stone. I believe you that there is Ogham writing on it. I take them seriously, but I don't want Polly involved in any of your... Mr. Murray pushed up from his plate so abruptly that he overturned his chair, righted it with an irritated grunt. The phone rang, making them all jump. Mr. Murray went to it. Polly, it's for you. This was no time for an interruption. She wanted her grandparents to put everything into perspective. If they could believe what happened, it would be less frightening. Sounds like Zachary. Her grandfather handed her the phone. Good morning, sweet Paul. I just wanted to tell you how good it was to see you yesterday, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Thanks, Zach. I look forward to it, too. Okay, see you then. Just wanted to double-check. She went back to the table. Yes, it was Zachary to confirm getting together on Thursday. Something nice and normal, her grandfather said. Is it? Polly asked. He did see someone from 3,000 years ago. All Hallows Eve, the bishop murmured. At least he'll get you away from here, her grandmother said. Strange, isn't it, that he should know about the Ogham stones? Polly nodded. Zachary tends to know all kinds of odd things, but what happened this morning is beyond me, the bishop said gently. 3,000 years beyond you, Polly, and somehow or other, I seem to be responsible for it. Mr. Murray went to the dresser, picked up one of the Ogham stones. Nathan, one reason I've tended to disbelieve you is that, if what you say is true, then you, a theologian and not a scientist, have made a discovery which has taken me a lifetime to work out. Blundered into it inadvertently, the bishop said. Mr. Murray sighed. I thought I understood it, now I'm not sure. Granddad, please explain. Mr. Murray sat down again, creakily. It's a theory of time, Polly. You know something about my work. A little. More than Nays, at any rate. You have a much better science background. Sorry, Nays, but I know, the bishop said. This is no time for niceties. He looked at Mrs. Murray. Would it be possible for me to have another helping of pancakes? Then back to Mr. Murray. This tesseract theory of yours? Mrs. Murray put another stack of pancakes on the bishop's plate. Mr. Murray said, Tessering, moving through space without restrictions of time, is, as you know, a mind thing. One can't make a machine for it. That would be to distort it, disturb the space-time continuum, in a vain effort to regulate something full of blazing glory to the limits of technology. And of course, that's what's happening. Abortive attempts at spaceships designed to break the speed of light and warp time It works well in the movies and on TV, but not in the reality of the created universe. What you ask is too difficult, the bishop said. How many people are willing to take lightning into their bodies? Mr. Murray smiled, and to Polly it was one of the saddest smiles she had ever seen. You are, her grandfather said. The bishop said softly, It was as if lightning flashed into my spirit, and with the light such a profound peace and joy came into my heart in one moment. I felt as if wholly revitalized by some infinite power, so that my body would be shattered like an earthen vessel. He sighed. That's John Thomas, a Welshman in the mid-1700s. But it's a good description, isn't it? Very good, Mr. Murray agreed, but it also shocks me. Why? The bishop asked. Because you know more than I do. No. But you don't know enough, Nays. You've opened a time gate that Anarel, whatever her name is, seems to be able to walk through, and which has drawn Polly through it. And I want it closed. Close it? How could it be closed? The door had been open and the winds of time were blowing against it, keeping it from closing, almost taking it off the hinges. No! Polly cried, stopping her grandfather in mid-sentence. You can't forbid me to go to the star-watching rock. Her grandfather sighed heavily. What a lifetime of working with the nature of the space-time continuum has taught me is that we know very little about space and even less about time. I don't know whether you and Nays have actually gone back 3,000 years or whether those young snow-capped mountains are some kind of hallucination, but I do know that you're in our care and we are responsible for you. The bishop poured more syrup onto his pancakes. Certainly some of the responsibility is mine. Polly looked into his eyes, a faded silver that still held light, but there was nothing of the fantastic or the madman in his steady gaze. But there was nothing of the fanatic or the madman in his steady gaze. Mr. Murray said, Nays, you've got to keep Polly out of this. You don't know enough. We human creatures can make watches and clocks and sensitive timing devices, but we don't understand what we're timing. When something has happened, it doesn't vanish, the bishop said. It makes waves, as sound does, or a pebble dropped into a pond. Time waves, Polly suggested. Energy waves, something to do with E equals MC squared. Nobody responded. Mr. Murray started clearing the table, moving creakily as though his joints pained him more than usual. Mrs. Murray sat looking out the window at the distant hills, her face unreadable. I don't know what to do about this. Mr. Murray turned from the sink to look directly at Polly. When we told your parents we'd love to have you come stay with us, it never occurred to your grandmother and me that you might get involved with Nays's discoveries. We didn't take them seriously enough, her grandmother said. We didn't want to. Under the circumstances, her grandfather said, should we send Polly home? Granddad, Polly protested. We can't keep you prisoner here, her grandmother said. Listen, Polly was fierce. I don't think you can send me away, really. If I'm into this Tesseract thing that Bishop Kalubra has opened, because that's what happened, isn't it? Then if you try to take me out of it, wouldn't that do something to, or maybe rip the space-time continuum? Her grandfather walked to the windows, looked out across his garden, then turned. It is a possibility. If time and space are one, the bishop suggested, then stopped. So it might, Polly continued, rip me too? I don't know, her grandfather said, but it's a risk I'd rather not take. Look, the bishop clapped his hands together softly. Thursday is All Hallows' Eve, Samhain, as Annie and Caralis might call it. The gates of time swing open most easily at this strange and holy time. If Polly will be willing to stay home until just until after Thursday night. Zachary's coming Thursday afternoon, Polly reminded them. I can't very well tell Zachary I can't go anywhere with him because Bishop Kalubra opened a tesseract, and somehow or other I've blundered into it. She tried to laugh. Is Zachary in it too? The bishop shook his head slowly. I think not. No, his seeing Caralis when he came to our time is one thing. Going through the time gate himself is quite another. If Zachary hasn't gone through the time gate, then he's not in the tesseract? I think not, the bishop repeated. Nor is Louise, even if, Whether she believes it or not, she saw Annie. Polly, Mr. Murray queried, you're sure Zachary saw this person? Well, Granddad, yes. Her grandfather had hot water running, and he held his hands under the tap, nodding slowly. Going somewhere with Zachary should be all right. Away from here, but not too far away. Nowhere near the star-watching rock. Just lie low until after Samhain, the bishop urged, and don't go swimming unless one of your grandparents is with you. She nodded. Okay, Samhain. What does that mean? It's the ancient Celtic New Year's festival, when the animals were brought down from their grazing grounds for the winter. The crops were harvested, and there was a great feast. Places were set at the festival dinner for those who had died during the previous year as a sign of honor and faith in the continuing of the spirits of the dead. It sounds like a sort of combination of Halloween and Thanksgiving, Polly said. And so it was. Pope Gregory III in the 8th century dedicated November 1st, All Saints' Day, and October 31st was All Hallows' Eve. So, Mr. Murray said dryly, the Christian Church, and not for the first time, took over and renamed a pagan holiday. The phone rang again. Interrupting them, Mrs. Murray went to it. Mr. Murray went to it. Yes, Louise, he's here. It would seem that somehow or other Polly walked into 3,000 years ago this morning, if such a thing is to be believed. No, I find it difficult too. Yes, we'll call. He turned back to the table. My little sister is a doctor, the bishop said. All right, Nason, we know your sister is a doctor. I made the mistake, if it was a mistake. Annie cut her finger deeply, badly. It needed stitching, and Cub, the young healer, is not experienced enough. And Corrales was away, so I brought Annie home with me. To now? To the present? Incredulity, shock, and anger combined in Mr. Murray's voice. Just long enough for Louise to fix her finger. I took her right back. Oh, nays, Mr. Murray groaned. You can't play around with time that way. I couldn't play around with Annie's finger either. Did Louise go along with you in this? She wasn't happy about it. But there we were in her office, and to tell you the truth, she had never seen Annie before, so it didn't occur to her to think in terms of 3,000 years ago. Her first reaction was that Annie needed help, and quickly, so she did what had to be done. When I told her who Annie was, she didn't really believe me, and I didn't press the point. She just told me to get Annie back to whatever or whenever it was she came from as quickly as possible. Nason, Mr. Murray stood up, sat down again. This isn't Star Trek. You can't just beam people back and forth. How did you do it? Well, now, I'm not exactly sure. That's part of the problem. Don't shout at me, Alex. I'm beyond shouting. Granddad? Polly tried to calm things down. Now that her grandparents were taking charge, the adventure began to seem exciting rather than terrifying. Your Tesseract thing, what you've been working on, space travel? It's to free us from the restrictions of time, isn't it? Yes, but purely for the purpose of extra-solar system exploration, that's all. We don't know enough to play around with it, as I know from my own experience. The bishop spoke softly. We climbed the Matterhorn because it was there. We went to the moon because it was there. We're going to explore the farthest planets in our solar system, and then in our own galaxy, and look toward the galaxies beyond because they're there. I didn't come to live with Louise with any idea of finding Ogham stones, but when I found one, well, I was interested because they were there. Here, Mr. Murray corrected. Here. I may have been foolish, but neither did I expect what has happened to Polly. Child, can you lie low till the weekend? Yes, go off somewhere on Thursday with your young man. Not that I think there's any real danger. But don't go to the star-watching rock. Can you wait until Sunday? I don't know. Polly looked troubled. I don't know if that would do any good because the first time I saw Honorable, it was right here, last night while I was swimming. The bishop held up his long, thin hands in a gesture of disclaimer, shook his head. The sunlight flashed off the topaz of his ring. I'm sorry. Then he looked at Polly. Or am I? We may be on to something. Nason, Mr. Murray warned. Mrs. Murray hit the palm of her hand softly against the table. This is Polly's study time. I think a little return to normalcy would be a good thing. There are some books up in her room she needs to look at. Good, Mr. Murray said. Perhaps this morning was just an aberration. By all means, let's try to return to normal. Polly went to the bishop. This Ogham writing, you said it's an alphabet? Do you have it written down? I mean, so that I could make sense of it? Yes, at home. Could I see it, please? Of course. I have what may be no more than my own version of Ogham in a notebook, but it's helped me translate the Ogham stones. I'll bring it over this afternoon. Mrs. Murray started to intervene, then closed her mouth. Thanks, Bishop, Polly said, and turned to go upstairs. Up in her room, Polly simply sat for a few minutes in the rocking chair, not reaching for the books. What she would have liked to do was go out to the star-watching rock. She was no longer afraid of being trapped in pastime. Somehow, the threshold was open to her, as it was to Anarel, but her grandparents would be upset and angry. Would it truly help if she stayed around the house until Thursday? Polly turned toward her night table and reached for the books. Studying for her grandparents was a tangible reality, a relief after the almost dream world of the lake and village of 3,000 years ago. Yes, she wanted to learn Ogham. If Anarel could learn English from the bishop, Polly could learn Ogham. Meanwhile, she would study. The Murrays were more demanding than her teachers at Cowperton High had been, and she was delighted at their challenge. She turned to the first book in the pile. All the books had been marked with slips of paper. The first was by John Locke, a 17th century philosopher. She knew that much, thanks to Max, who had frequently augmented whatever Polly had given at Cowpertown High. These were Locke's impressions of America, idyllic, and, she thought, a little naive, but Locke was writing from the far past, though only centuries ago, not millennia, when the new continent was fresh and still uncorrupted by the accumulated evils of the old world. The naked Amerindians seemed to Locke to live a life as innocent as Adam and Eve in the garden. They lived without external laws, did not buy or sell or pile up wealth. They were, Locke implied, without shame, not burdened by the guilt of the past. The book on her lap, Polly thought. There is no evidence that there had ever been Celts or Druids on these shores when the early settlers landed. Had they been assimilated into the local tribes, as Corrales and Tav seemed to have been taken into Anarel's people, gone back to Britain? If there really were Druids in New England 3,000 years ago, what had happened to them? She sighed, opened the second book to the page her grandmother had marked. It was by Alexis de Tocqueville, writing on the troubled period of Andrew Jackson, when the Indians were treated with terrible unfairness. Yet Tocqueville wrote that the settlers in America had arrived at a state of democracy without having to endure a democratic revolution, and that they were born free without having to become so. Still true? Polly thought of herself as having been born free, and yet in the short span of her life, she had witnessed much abuse of freedom. Surely the lusts and guilts and greeds of the old world had taken root in the new, and despite her affection for the natives of Gaia, and the Quistano Indians in Venezuela, she was leery of the concept of the noble savage. People in her experience were people, some good, some bad, most a mixture. Next in the pile was Lectiones Geometricae, published by Isaac Barrow in 1670. And despite Polly's proficiency with languages, she could not concentrate on the old Latin, so she put it aside for when she could focus better. She read a marked chapter in a history of the 16th century, learning that Giordano Bruno had been burned at the stake for heresy, including the proposal, horrifying to the church establishment of those days, that there are as many times as there are planets. And even one planet, Polly thought, has many time zones, and when we try to cross them too quickly, we get jet lag. And even in one zone, time doesn't move at a steady rate. She remembered a day of lying in bed with flu and fever, every joint aching, and the day dragged on, far longer than an ordinary day, And then there was a New Year's Eve party at Max's beautiful plantation house. Beau Allaire, with Max sparkling as brightly as the crystal chandeliers, and there had been singing and charades, and the evening passed in the twinkling of an eye. Poor Giordano Bruno. He was probably right about time. How many people have been burned at the stake for being right? Then came a book by an 18th century philosopher, Berkeley. She sat with the book unopened on her lap. Max had talked to her about this philosopher, who was also a bishop. Was he anything like Bishop Calubra, who had had the idea, amazing in his day, that the stars outside his study were not there unless he was aware of them, that things had to be apprehended to be. The anthropic principle, Max had called it, and had seen it as both fascinating and repellent. If Polly did not believe that she had seen and talked with Anarel, would that keep the other girl in the past where she belonged? Would it close the threshold? But she had seen Anarel, and there was no way she could pretend that she hadn't. The threshold was opened. Last in the pile was a copy of the New England Journal of Medicine, with an article by her grandmother on the effect of the microscopic and macroscopic universe. What might seem to have been a random assortment of books was beginning to reveal a pattern, and the pattern seemed to Polly to have something to do with Anarel and the Ogham stones, though she did not think that her grandmother had had either Anarel or the Ogham stones in mind when she had chosen the readings, any more than she had had Polly in mind when she redecorated the bedroom. Polly studied for a couple of hours, making notes, absorbing, so that she would be able to answer her grandparents' questions. She was fully focused on the present moment, and she did not know what made her look at her watch. It was after 11. One of her jobs was to drive to the post office for the mail. If something was needed for lunch or dinner, her grandmother would leave a note with the outgoing mail. She went downstairs, no one in the living room or kitchen. Her grandmother's lab door was closed, but Polly knocked. "What?" came a not very gracious response. "It's Polly. Is it all right if I get the mail and go to the store?" "Oh, Polly, come in. I didn't mean to snarl. I suppose it's no use wishing Nays had never retired and come to live with Louise." Her grandmother was sitting on her tall lab stool. There was an electron microscope in front of her, but the cover was over it and looked as though it had not been removed in years. She wore a tweed skirt, lisle stockings, a turtleneck, and a cardigan. A down-to-earth country woman, and yet Polly knew that her grandmother delved deep into the world of the invisible, the strange, submicroscopic world of quantum mechanics. Her grandfather looked more comfortable in an old plaid flannel shirt, riding his tractor, and yet he had actually gone into space, orbiting the Earth beyond the confines of the atmosphere. Her grandparents seemed to live comfortably in their dual worlds, the daily world of the garden, kitchen, house, and pool, and the wider world of their scientific experiments. But Bishop Calubra had thrown them completely off course. Bishop Calubra and Polly's own unexpected journey through time. "Grand? I don't know, Polly. I don't know what your parents would say." Her voice trailed off. "Just to the post office and the store, Grand. I didn't want to go without asking you." Her grandmother sighed. "Have I been living in a dream world? The only piece of equipment in my lab that gets any real use is the obsolete Bunsen burner, because it's become a family tradition. Like your grandfather, I've been doing thought experiments." As Polly looked at her questioningly, she continued, "Alex and I have sat in our separate worlds doing experiments in our minds." "And," Polly prodded, "if a thought experiment is capable of laboratory proof, then we're apt to write a paper about it, and then either we or another scientist will put it to the test. But quite a few thought experiments are so wildly speculative that it will be a long time before they can be proven." Which was more of a dream, the thought experiments in the minds of her grandparents and other scientists, or the world of 3,000 years ago, which was touching on their own time? The lab was damp. Polly wondered how her grandmother stood it. The floor was made of great slabs of stone. There was a faded rag rug in front of two shabby easy chairs, and the lamp on the table between them gave at least an illusion of warmth. Only the permeating cold grounded her in present reality. "Grand? What is it, Polly?" The post office? I suppose so. We can't keep you wrapped in cotton wool. I'm not even sure what we're afraid of. That I'll get lost 3,000 years ago? I don't think that's going to happen. Neither do I. I still haven't given it my willing suspension of disbelief. But just the post office. We're out of milk. All right, the store. But check in with me when you get back. Sure. Polly would keep her word and go only to the post office and the store. What she wanted was to talk to Anarel again. Go to the grandfather oak and see Corrales and his dog, and hope that this time he would stay and talk with her. Thursday was All Hallows Eve, and Bishop Calubra took it with great seriousness. Samhain, a festival so old that it predated written history. Polly's skin prickled, not with fear now, but with expectation, though for what she was not sure. All she knew was that she was touching on that long gone age as it rose out of the past to touch on another age, a present that was perhaps as brutal as any previous age, but was at least familiar. Her grandparents' car was elderly, and it took a few tries before the engine turned over, and she shifted into reverse and pulled out of the garage. She went to the post office, to the store, speaking to the postmistress and the checkout girl, who were curious and friendly and already knew her by name. When she got home, her grandmother had left the lab and was making toasted cheese sandwiches for lunch. They had just finished eating and were putting the dishes away when they heard a car pull up noisily. Bishop Calubra. Just a quick visit, he said. Louise made me promise to come right back. I just wanted to bring Polly my Ogham notebook. He sat down at the table, indicated the chair next to him, and spread out the book between them. It was tidily and consistently done, vocabulary and simple rules of grammar, and a few phrases and idioms. Druids had a vast amount of information in their memories after long years of training, but Ogham was an oral language rather than a written one. What I have here is in no way pure Ogham. It's what Anarel, Corrales, and the people of the wind speak today. There today, that is. In 3 columns, he had listed words used by Anarel's people before Corrales and Tav came. Then there were words which were strictly Ogham, and which Corrales and Tav had brought to the language, plus a short column of words which were still recognizable today, such as Glen, Craig, Bard, Cairn. You can read my writing? He asked. Yes, it's lots clearer than mine. Fascinating, isn't it, to see how language evolves? I wonder how many of our English-American words will still be around in another 1,000 years or so. He stood up. I must go. Polly picked up the notebook. Thanks a lot, Bishop. I'm glad you've written out the pronunciation phonetically. She turned to the pages, nodding. Well, he stood on one leg, scratching his shin with the other foot, looking more like a heron than ever. It's pretty arbitrary of me to call it Ogham, but it seems simplest. The language has evolved fairly easily. A sort of lingua franca. Bishop, you did teach Anarel to speak English. Shh. He put his foot down and glanced at Mrs. Murray, who was feeding the fire, and at Mr. Murray, deep in an article in a scientific journal. He leaned over the chair toward Polly. She's very bright. She learned amazingly quickly, but you've spent a lot of time with her. He glanced again at her grandparents, sighed deeply. This is no time for secrecy, is it? Yes. Whenever the time gate is open for me, I've gone through. But you... He shook his head. I have to go. He ambled toward the pantry door. You will stay close to your grandparents. She too sighed. Yes, Bishop, I will. And that is the end of chapter 3.